Okay. Welcome, everyone. I hope I hope everyone is doing well. We, as some of you know, we're having some weather issues on the East Coast today, and my power has been flickering all day, on and off. It seems to be holding steady, so we'll just get started and hope for the best. On behalf of the National Transit Institute, I welcome you and thank you for participating. The National Transit Institute develops, promotes, and delivers training and education programs for the public transit industry in the United States. Today's webinar is based on important clarifications and report year changes for 2020 annual NTD reporting. We are pleased to have as our presenters today, Joe Eldridge, Matt Bonzik, and Bailey Krause from Boyd Caton Group. Joe Eldridge serves as the project manager for the NTD Validation Services team. He has 10 years of experience in the public transit industry and holds a BS in Systems Engineering Psychology from the University of Virginia. Matt Bonzik joined the NTD team in October 2012. He graduated from the University of North Carolina with an MS in Mathematics. He serves as the Quality Assurance Lead for the National Transit Database. Bailey Krause joined the NTD team in August of 2014. She graduated from Michigan State University with a BS in Psychology. She currently serves as the validation messenger for the National for the National Transit Database. I'm told today's session should run about an hour because we expect the presentation to take the entire 60 minutes. Please ask your questions at any time by typing it in the Q&A box. If you don't see the Q&A box, you have to kind of toggle it on and off. It's not the chat box, it's a dedicated Q&A box. It's much easier to manage the questions as they appear in the Q&A box rather than the chat, which, as many of you know, can get very filled up and scroll. So if we see you asking questions in the chat, we'll try to redirect you into the Q&A box. If you can open the chat window, you probably should be able to find the Q&A box. So take a look for that because that's how the questions are going to be answered. As soon as I turn this over, I will paste the link to the handouts in the chat box so everybody can grab those. If it scrolls away, I can paste it a couple of times so everybody can get it. And I guess without any further ado, I will turn the presentation over to Joe.
All right, Lori, thank you very much for that nice introduction. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Like Lori said, we've had our share in Virginia of power outages over the last day. It's looking clear now, so hopefully that means no hitches. But if we do run into problems, you know, we're luckily Bailey, Matt, and I geographically separated here, so the one will take over for the other if you'll just bear with us. But hopefully it's smooth sailing from here, and it's really great to see high attendance in this session. This is higher than we've normally had for this type of session in terms of NTD reporting. I think that's really good news. It means you all are interested in getting in the know about the changes that are happening for NTD in 2020. Although we've had an extended 2019 in terms of the reporting cycle, and some are still wrapping up the report. We're excited to turn ahead to this next new year, and obviously a lot of these clarifications are going to be important because of just how novel our operating environments are in 2020. So we really hope this will answer a lot of questions you have about the data collection and reporting processes. And if you know of any stakeholders within your agencies or other colleagues who aren't able to make it today, we encourage you to let them know this will be recorded and to share the information that you glean from this session. If someone couldn't make it and needs to access the recording after the fact, we encourage you to reach out to the NTD Help Desk or your validation analyst. We'll present the Help Desk contact information in a moment. Okay, so sorry, my slide was not advancing. So the goal of this webinar is to identify changes and clarifications for the upcoming report year. This is designed for all reporter types, be it urban, reduced, full reporters, rural, tribal transit operators. Not every change we cover in this webinar will apply to every reporter type, and we'll try to make it clear as we go which policies pertain only to certain types. Given that this is an unusual environment, again, that we're operating in, we anticipate a lot of questions, encourage you to ask questions in the Q&A pod, like Lori said. If you aren't sure whether a question applies to everyone, you can also feel free to use the chat to ask just the panelists. If it's kind of a narrower question that you think may only apply to your agency, as I mentioned, there's also a validation analyst. It's an assigned resource from the Operations Center staff at NTD dedicating to assisting you with any reported concerns. And hopefully most of you know who those folks are. You can find the information for those people on the reporter profile in the NTD reporting system, which we'll see the location of during this presentation. So what are we setting out to accomplish today? We want to discuss the impacts of COVID-19 on data reporting for this upcoming report year, present a new type of service, and discuss when to report with this type of service, and present the change in a different type of service, and then discuss general reporting clarifications and updates. So this is the contact information for the NTD Help Desk. The Help Desk is available from 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. Eastern Time. You can call the number there or send an email to the email address there if you're unable to reach your assigned analyst, or maybe if you're just not sure who that person is and need help getting in touch with them. Our contact information is here in the deck as well. Our program contacts from FTA are Tom Coleman and Mishadoni Smith. Their email addresses are found here as well. Tom is the NTD program manager, and Mishadoni is the chief of the analysis division, both with FTA's Office of Budget and Policy. Okay, so a question on the minds of many may be the reporting cycle for next year. The FDA will be sticking as closely as possible to a normal data reporting schedule for report year 2020. The annual report due dates for your fiscal year 2020 are dependent on your fiscal year end date, shown in the left-hand column there of that table. And other important deadlines are shown in this table, but really it's that third column, annual report due date, that might be most meaningful to many of you. So October 31st, if your fiscal year ends on or before June 30th, 2020, it will be October 31st, 2020, by which you need to submit the NTD report. If your fiscal year ends after that and before September 30th, it will be January 31st, 2021. And if your fiscal year ends after September 30th and before or on December 31st, the last day of 2020, then your annual report will be due on April 30th. As it says at the top here, the target launch for 2020 reporting, meaning when do forms become available for me to submit, is sometime in mid to late September. So the changes we're covering today will be present in the system at that time, and we'll move to talking about resources available for that. So FDA has provided the following reference materials, including the 2020 reporting manual, which covers standard reporting policy. Again, most of this policy has not changed from the prior year. We'll focus today on what things have changed, which policies have changed, and other important clarifications you might see in the manual. There are two references there: a reduced reporting policy manual and a full reporting policy manual are both linked on this page that you'll be taken to here. Reduced and rural reporters will want to consult the reduced manual, as it omits data elements that aren't required for those reporter types. The same is true for agencies who only operate asset data to the NTD, who only report asset data, to the NTD as a result of the Transit Asset Management Final Rule. Those reporter types should find most of the information they need in the reduced reporting manual. The next document on this list is the guide for NTD reporting and COVID-19. Because additional administrative guidance became necessary for 2020 reporting. A lot of those clarifications we wanted to organize in a one-stop shop, if you will. So the clarifications we're going to cover in this webinar that pertain to operating changes as a result of COVID-19 are found in that document. And then there's a frequently asked questions page that FTA maintains, which is broader than just NTD reporting, but will also include some of this information that's kind of high level need to know for this upcoming report year. So we're going to move on to reviewing those key points from that document, the COVID-19 and NTD reporting guide. The first of which pertains to NTD data and how it's used in FTA's formula apportionments. So some of you will know that several of FTA's grant programs use NTD data in federal formula apportionments. So for the upcoming federal fiscal year 2021, these programs will use report year 2019 NTD data as normal. As all the 2019 fiscal years ended before the pandemic's sweeping effect on public transportation, there are no changes to the data points that will be used or the processes that feed into those apportionment formulas. In the following federal fiscal year apportionment, FY 2022, FTA intends to use that same 2019 data as a default instead of fiscal year 2020 as they normally would. And this is an unusual event, as normally this type of change in a data source can only be done with a hold harmless adjustment request in the NTD, which are approved by FTA. But because FTA would otherwise anticipate a very high volume of those requests, it will use 2019 data by default. There's no need for your agency to request a hold harmless adjustment. It will be processed automatically. This means FTA needs to record cases when your agency, if and when your agency chooses to use 2020 data instead. Agencies should only consider making that request if the Federal Funding Allocation Statistics form on the FFA 10 or for states across all RR20 forms. If those statistics on the form are objectively higher in 2020 than they were in 2019, that's when an agency can consider requesting that FTA use its 2020 data for the FY 2022 federal apportionment. To this end, agencies should continue to coordinate with their analysts, should coordinate with other local stakeholders about this type of decision to make sure FTA records the request properly. We encourage you to reach out to your NTD analyst if you have questions about this, and we'll route those requests appropriately if they are more programmatic concerns. So I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague Matt Bonzik, who's going to discuss other important clarifications that FTA is making to address the unique challenges agencies are facing right now in terms of data collection and NTD reporting.
Hey, thanks, Joe. Can I just get a check that you can hear me?
We can hear you.
Hear you, Matt.
Great, thank you. So as everyone knows, 2020 is a really unusual year. A lot of agencies, I would say all agencies, have had large changes to their service because of COVID-19. And so we're getting a lot of questions about how agencies should report their 2020 data, given how unusual it is. So this section, I'm going to discuss how FTA is interpreting its normal reporting requirements, given the unusual nature of the 2020 data. So first of all, some of you may be operating emergency services. Emergency services that might be carried out in coordination with medical centers or emergency management agencies in response to the pandemic generally are not regular and continuing. And service needs to be regular and continuing in order to meet the statutory definition of public transportation. So these services are not reportable to the NTD. You also may be operating non-passenger services, for example, meal delivery. We're aware that some agencies are funding meal delivery services using CARES Act funds, but simply the fact that it's funded by the CARES Act does not necessarily make it public transportation. A service that does not involve transport of passengers is not considered public transportation and cannot be reported to the NTD. The S10 form for full reporters is where you report your service data, miles, hours, that sort of thing. And you have to report average weekday, average Saturday, and average Sunday data in addition to annual totals. So one question some people may have is, in an ordinary year, your service is not going to vary that much over the 12 months of the year. Maybe there's a little seasonality to it. But 2020 is certainly unusual, where you most likely in March had a big drop off in service and then probably a gradual recovery as the nation reopens. So in order to calculate the averages, you're going to treat the entire year as normal for the purpose of reporting the averages. As usual, there are single day exceptions. For example, if you had a single day with very high service because of serving a sporting event, that would not be included in the average. That's what we call an atypical day. But you should include both data from the normal period before and after the pandemic, and also data from the abnormal period. So probably what we're going to see is the average weekday, average Saturday, and average Sunday data will be a lot less than the previous year. If you suspended a mode completely during the pandemic period, don't include those days in the calculation of the average. Instead, you should record those as days not operated. At the bottom of the S10 form, you record the number of days operated and the number of days not operated. We are expecting to see lower service data values than usual. Ordinarily, we have validation that flags large changes in data. So ordinarily, if you reported 30% lower miles than the previous year, that would trigger a validation flag. This year, we are adjusting our validation to hopefully reduce that burden, because if the service goes down 30%, we already know that that's because of COVID-19. We don't need to ask that again. Service consumed data is the category that we use to describe unlinked passenger trips and passenger miles traveled. So this is data about passenger behavior. And we know that it's been a challenge to collect these data during the pandemic. Some agencies may have moved to rear door boardings, and so that could interfere with collecting ridership data. Agencies may have gone fare free for some period, which could also interfere. And of course, some agencies use onboard ride checkers to collect these data. So on March 25th of this year, FTA sent a notification to all of our reporters asking you to suspend your NTD sampling activities if they do include those onboard data collectors, the ride checkers. And then on June 25th, we announced a new policy basically describing how you should report for 2020 and going forward, given the possible disruptions to your sampling. If you have specific questions about the way that you're collecting the data, I encourage you to talk to your analyst. We know that there are going to be a lot of agencies that have to estimate at least some period of the year. So just talk to your analyst and we'll figure out whether you need a waiver or what would be the best way for you to report those data. So this is not new. This is a new flowchart, but it's an old policy. The idea here is to tell you whether you need to sample annually or triennially. for passenger miles traveled. And so just to summarize, I think most agencies have 100% count of unlinked passenger trips. That's boardings, ridership. If you do not have 100% count of UPT, then you do need to sample annually, both for UPT and PMT. If you do have 100% count and you're quote unquote a small agency, then you can sample triennially for passenger miles traveled. And then in the other 2 years of the 3-year cycle, you would use the average passenger trip length to estimate passenger miles traveled. That's the average passenger trip length that you determined from your sample. So for those of you who are triennial samplers, ordinarily 2020 would be a mandatory sampling year. So the way it works is all agencies are on the same 3-year cycle. 2017 was the last mandatory year. 2020 was scheduled to be the next mandatory year. FTA has decided 2020 is no longer a mandatory year because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Instead, 2023 will be the next mandatory year. So essentially, we're just skipping a cycle. You can opt to sample before 2023 if you choose. Just talk to your analyst if you have any questions about that. In the meantime, you should use your most recent sample of average passenger trip length to estimate passenger miles traveled. For most agencies, that'll be the 2017 sample. A few agencies may have sampled in 2018 or 2019. If you're an annual sampling agency and you use ride checkers, the onboard data collectors, then FTA is not giving an all clear. FTA recognizes that conditions are different in different regions. So it's up to the agency to determine whether it's when the conditions are safe to resume data collection. You should talk to your analyst about how to estimate or report data from the period when you were not sampling. If you sample annually and you do not use ride checkers, you have, for example, APCs, or some smaller agencies might have the driver record all the ons and offs. So in other words, you're able to collect passenger miles traveled without putting a ride checker on board, then you should continue doing that. Hopefully your data collection should not be impacted. And again, if it is impacted, then talk to your analyst and we'll develop a way forward. So for 2020 and beyond, you should have seen this already. This was part of the blast email that went out in June. The flowchart reads from left to right, and it basically says what I said on the last slide. So if you are using ride checker data, then restart when it's safe. Until then, you can use any available data from the last report year to estimate. If you're using a method that does not use ride checkers, then just continue what you're doing. And if you're a triennial sampler, then your mandatory sampling year is postponed until 2023. All right, the next topic is ways that social distancing in public transit might be impacting your data, how to report that to NTD. Many agencies are limiting their ride sharing. For example, van pool services may have limited the number of passengers allowed in the vehicle. Also, ride sharing transportation network company services, we're aware, have suspended ride sharing during the pandemic. So if this is a temporary cessation of ride sharing and the plan is to return to normal ride sharing policies once the pandemic is over, then this is still considered public transportation service. It does still have to meet the other requirements as public transportation, So in order to report it, it would have to be purchased transportation by your agency. There are a few other related requirements, but basically the message here is that if you've suspended your ride sharing during the pandemic, you should still continue to report those services as public transportation. One adaptation that agencies may be making is using double heading vehicles. So the idea here is that the capacity of a bus has been reduced by policy. Maybe you've roped off certain seats, or maybe you've just instituted a maximum passenger load that's lower than it would usually be. And so agencies might have an extra bus that shadows the scheduled bus, and the extra bus simply comes into service when the first bus fills up, when it fills the capacity that is allowed by current policy. And so the way to report that is as revenue service, so vehicle revenue miles, vehicle revenue hours. So as long as that shadow bus, that double-headed bus, is in route service, even if it's not been opened to passengers yet, you should report that as public transportation, reported as revenue service. A slightly different way of accomplishing a similar thing is using a floating vehicle. So the idea here is that you would station a bus at some convenient location, and then you could dispatch that bus as needed, either to a route that gets crowded or to a place where a vehicle breaks down, or for whatever other reason you need an extra vehicle. So if the floating vehicle does get dispatched into service, then you should report those miles and hours data as revenue service. If the vehicle never gets dispatched, if it just waits at the staging area and then doesn't go into service, do not report those miles and hours. Sitting and standing capacity are reported on the A30 form. That's the revenue vehicle inventory form. We're aware that some agencies may have reduced by policy their seating and standing capacity on vehicles during the pandemic. We do not want you to update your vehicle inventory to reflect any temporary changes like that. The idea of the form is to capture the physical construction of the vehicle. So do not change the seating or standing capacity if you're just going to have to change it back the next year. There can also be impacts to your expenses and your funding sources related to COVID, so I'm going to discuss that. So one concept that we should talk about is extraordinary and special items. These are expenses or revenues that are related to extraordinary events, such as, usually we have natural disasters in mind, but COVID-19 certainly qualifies as that type of event. So on the S10 form for full reporters, we have these special fields, extraordinary and special items, within 4 different areas of the form. That's state, local, federal, and directly generated. The example you see on the screen here is the state section. And so you can see 4430 is state extraordinary and special items. So some examples during the pandemic. These examples are examples of expenses. So these are things that would ordinarily be on the F30 form. But you might have taken extraordinary measures like procuring personal protective equipment. You might be providing additional sanitation and cleaning services. You might be putting out extra public messaging about your new policies or about social distancing. You might have furloughed employees with pay or with partial pay or just with benefits. You might be placing more operators on the extra board than would ordinarily be needed given the level of service provided. And you might be providing extra benefits to employees such as additional sick leave. So these are all additional expenses that you've incurred because of the pandemic. And so these are considered extraordinary and special items, which means that they don't get included on the F30 form. Instead, they go on the F40 form, which is the reconciling items form. There's a line on that form for extraordinary and special items. And so these are not reported by mode, they're just on the F40 form. There's a single one for the whole report. There also might be indirect or overhead expenses that are incurred because of these pandemic-related items. So those would also be considered extraordinary and special. And you could also have capital costs that are extraordinary and special. So going back to revenues, I'm sure everyone's aware of the CARES Act. This is providing assistance to a lot of transit agencies as well as individuals and businesses. So we are adding a field to the F10 form for full reporters and to the RR20 form for reduced reporters to report CARES Act funding. If you're using that CARES Act funding for your normal operating expenses, then you just report it on the CARES Act line. However, if the funding is being used for extraordinary and special expenses, like the ones that I discussed, let me go back to that slide, these sorts of expenses, these pandemic-related expenses, then those revenues are considered extraordinary and special as well. And so instead of reporting that on the CARES Act line, you would report that in the extraordinary and special items line within the federal funding section. All right, and then there's data about your employees. So on the R10 form, you report employee hours and employee counts. So if your employees are working on activities that are considered extraordinary and special items, as we discussed a couple slides ago, then just like you wouldn't include those expenses on the F30 form, you include them on the F40 instead. You should not include those hours, those work hours on the R10 form. So those work hours don't get reported in the NTD. You should include a count of all employees at your fiscal year end, just like you would in a normal year. And just to clarify, if you have employees that are furloughed due to COVID-19, you should include those in your employee count on the R10 form. All right, so I'm going to kick it back to Joe, and he's going to talk about changes to the NTD reporting system.
Thank you, Matt. Sorry, I was finishing up answering a question there. Thank you all for keeping the questions coming on the Q&A pod. All right, so like Matt said, we're now going to cover the changes to the reporting system in 2020. These were, unlike the clarifications Matt just went through, these were planned changes to the reporting system that have been in the works, have been in development before, even in some cases before the 2019 year started. So the first change is a change to the system layout, which will take effect when annual reporting for 2020 launches. So these are high-level layout changes within the Appian reporting tool where NTD is housed that are designed to make navigation more efficient within the application. So if you're a system user now, you may be aware that there's already an updated homepage in that system. And this is just a reminder that selecting NTD as a favorite application by clicking the star which we recommend, especially if that's the only application you use. That will allow you to bypass the home page at each login unless there's an announcement that's required to acknowledge before proceeding. But normally what that means is once you've clicked on the NTD site, once you've logged in, you'll be taken immediately to this screen. So this essentially will be your new landing page within the NTD. The first thing you'll notice if you're used to the current format is a slightly updated banner at the top. So there was previously a tab called Records, and that you would have to click into, and then you would see various report packages depending on your permissions and your role within the NTD reporting system. Those packages have been collapsed into this Home tab, and you'll see there's a new banner right below the FTA emblem, the DOT emblem there, where it says FTA. You'll see Annual, Monthly, Safety, and Profile. So those are, the first three of those are the old Records tab. The annual reporting packages will now be included in Annual, Monthly ridership now in Monthly, and Safety now in Safety. And the last module here is your agency's profile, which includes the basic information that you can modify anytime. And in fact, you should update regularly if changes to your address or users on the report or your modes and type of service operated are changed. And speaking of types of service, so the next most significant change to the reporting system itself, a mechanism, is available on the P20 form and pertains to those types of service. This will only affect agencies who either contract with taxi cab operators or contract with transportation network companies to provide on-demand or demand response-based service. But it's good information to know if you're involved in NTD reporting, because it's a kind of a fundamental aspect of reporting that has changed. So FTA now distinguishes different types of purchase transportation by what type of entity it is that your agency is purchasing transportation from. As these types of contractual relationships have increased, FTA modified its reporting system through a Federal Register notice, and that was published in July of was finalized, I should say, in July of 2019 to further stratify public transportation by the type of service provided. So kind of to review, directly operated service, or DO, that remains the type of service to select for any mode, for example, demand response or bus mode, for which your transit agency is the operator of the mode. So those are directly operated services. FTA requires agencies contracting for public transportation to select for purchase transportation, to select a purchase transportation type of service. So if you're contracting with a transportation network company, you're now going to select purchase transportation TN. If you're contracting with a taxi provider, you will now select taxi TX. Any other contract for service with a general operator will just be general PT. So to review here, FTA defined a transportation network company in its register notice in 2019 for purposes of NTD reporting, and provided discussion on this type of service in its reporting manual, including some examples in the last appendix in the manual, Appendix E. But report year 2020 is the first report year when this will take effect in the system as its own type of service. So in this case, because it is a new type of service, FTA is making that available right now, right away, to agencies to begin transferring their monthly ridership and safety data to this type of service. So if your agency has an agreement with a transportation network company, some familiar ones are Uber and Lyft, and those agencies are providing public transportation, and you've discussed that already with the analyst. In some cases, it may have resulted in filling out a questionnaire. You must update that type of service for your demand response mode. It was presumably before demand response purchase transportation. It should now be demand response TN, transportation network companies. We strongly encourage you, if you're in that situation, to coordinate that effort with your NTD analyst. In contrast, the addition of taxi type of service is really not an addition. It's replacing the existing mode, demand response taxi. So previously, agencies did not need to make changes for this type of service. Or excuse me, moving forward, agencies do not need to make any change for this type of service. Unlike the transportation network company, this change is going to happen in the reporting system automatically. So the week prior to the open of the report year 2020, FTA will be migrating data from the demand taxi mode with purchase transportation type of service into the demand response mode with a taxi type of service. All of the reporting requirements will be exactly the same. So if you have a DT, PT mode currently in the system, there's nothing that you'll need to do differently moving forward in terms of data collection, except acknowledge that demand response taxi is now how it will appear, with demand response as the mode and taxi as the type of service. Just to demonstrate how this will look in the reporting system, so this is a mock-up of the P20 form. You'll be using this transportation network type of service if you contract with TNCs. Similarly, if you contract with taxi operators, you'll see that taxi is available for that type of service. And again, if you already had that entered there as demand response taxi purchase transportation, you'll see a switch when the reporting system opens up for annual reporting in 2020. I'm now going to turn it over to Bailey Krause, who will present on general clarifications for this report year.
All right, great. Thank you, Joe. I'll be finishing up the presentation with some general clarifications to the system. The first one is where to report Medicaid funding. Agencies should report Medicaid funding of non-emergency medical transportation trips as an organization-paid fare. In prior years, this type of funding may have been reported to, Can you all hear me? Now better?
Yeah, Kelly, we were having some trouble hearing you.
Interesting. Okay, I apologize about that. So in prior years, this type of funding may have been reported to other federal funding where you've entered a comment or under the state funding lines. This affects all reporter types reporting financial data to the NTD and will be reported by mode and type of service. So please make sure to break out the funding between modes under the fare lines accordingly as seen here in the F10. The RR20 will similarly provide fields to break the funding out by mode and type of service. All right, the next clarification is regarding interim finance mechanism. Sometimes transit agencies incur costs with the intention to use a federal grant to pay for the cost. However, if the grant funds have not yet been committed at the time of the cost is incurred, the agency finances the cost using other sources of funds and expects to be reimbursed with federal funds. Agencies must report the final source used to pay for the cost, not the interim financing mechanism. So for example, an agency may record expenses against an FTA grant, even though it has not been reimbursed. When the agency has pre-award authority, an agency may also employ this practice if it incurs costs that are not covered by a full funding grant agreement with FTA. In both cases, the agency records the final source of funding on the NTD report. All right, so many purchase transportation service contracts have penalty provisions for services not provided according to the standards set by the transit agencies. These penalty provisions, or sometimes called liquidated damages, apply to areas such as scheduled trips not operated, arrival and departure times operated much later than scheduled, poor adherence to maintenance schedules for vehicle inspections and cleaning. Generally, the transit agencies apply these penalty provisions as deductions to the invoices submitted by the contractors. So, for example, a contractor may submit a monthly invoice to the transit agency for $500,000, but incurred a penalty of $5,000. So the transit agency would go ahead and pay the $495,000. So the total invoice at $500 minus the penalties of $5,000. The transit agency must report what it pays the contractor's operating costs plus the contractor's profit less the penalty deduction when the agency reports its total expenses to the NTD. Then, if the agency is a full reporter, they must allocate those deductions among the 5 functions, so the vehicle operations, vehicle maintenance, facility maintenance, general admin, and capital leasing when you do report those totals for the functions. There is a very good exhibit in the 2020 policy manual that will show exactly how this will work. All right, so the last clarification in this presentation is for mechanical failures. So for background, full reporters must report data on mechanical system failures for revenue vehicles. Revenue vehicle system failures are mechanical problems that occur when a vehicle does not complete its scheduled revenue trip or a vehicle does not start its next scheduled revenue trip. A transit agency must count each system failure as it occurs, even if the agency immediately substitutes another vehicle and no revenue service, is lost. Additionally, an agency must report a failure even if the agency later determines there is no actual problem with the vehicle. So the clarification that I'm getting around to is that your agency should not include mechanical failures that occur in the yard or grounds of the maintenance facility during the pullout operations in the count of mechanical failures. The counting of mechanical failures starts after a revenue vehicle departs from the yard or grounds of the maintenance facility. All right, so this does end our presentation. Again, here is our help desk information. It's available to you Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. Eastern, as well, of course, as your assigned analyst. Again, FTA will link the webinar to its presentations page on the NTD program site soon. If there's any questions that you haven't asked, please direct them either to your assigned analyst or the help desk.
So Lori, one question we have here is just
Sure.
about getting a printout of question and answers.
I think I know I can get a copy. I'm trying to think if it's available for participants. I don't know if there's a save option. If you want a copy, I guess shoot me an email at lglickman@ntd. No, my God, NTI. I have NTD on the brain. You know what? I'm just going to put my email in the chat box because this this has been a crazy weather day. So it's I'll email me if you want a copy of the Q&A. How's that?
Thanks, Lori. and we have 10 minutes, so there's been a lot of good questions coming in. If we have some that haven't been answered that we can try and take live, I'm happy to do that now, as long as that works for you, Lori.
So we have 10 minutes, should I moderate the questions like we used to do, or what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's fine. If that works, we'll just read what's coming into the.
Okay. Do you want me to read it and then you answer?
Sure.
Okay. So the most recent open question is from Justin Cole. It says, for the new TNC mode, there is a flow chart in the manual appendix that indicates that if the agency does not pay the full cost of the contract, the service is not reportable. Can you describe what that guidance is intended to address? Would it restrict service with a fare structure where the agency covers the cost of a trip up to a certain dollar amount or cap, with the amount above to be covered by rider? That's a lot of questions.
Hey, this is Matt. I can answer that question. So in NTD, you would report any amount paid by the rider as a fare. And so that goes into the cost of the service. So as long as you are including that that fare payment by the rider, then you are reporting the full cost of the service. So what would not be, what would be excluded would be, for example, if you have some other entity, like maybe a human service organization or maybe a different local government that's also contributing to the service. So the service has revenues that are paying for it beyond what your agency and the rider are paying.
Hopefully that answered the question. Another person would like to know where we can find out who our validation analyst is. Okay, great, Justin, thanks.
You can find that out in the reporting system. Earlier I had a slide that had the profile on it. So when you log in, you'll be directed to home, click profile, and you should see that person's name there. I think it's also available on the annual NTD report package. If you're a full reporter, you'll also have a separate contact for safety reporting. So any of those names can be found there. And if you don't have access to that, I just encourage you to contact the help desk, NTD Help at DOT.gov.
That's great. They're asking me to share my email. It's in the chat box. Do you have the chat, Priscilla? At the bottom where you found the Q&A, there's a little button for chat. I did put it in there. I will type it here as well, though, so I'll type it correctly. There we go. Anonymous attendee wants copies of the slideshow. That was also pasted into the chat. I can put it in there again. Does anybody have any other questions?
We have a question here about how agency reported ridership will be validated. So I think I'm inferring something here too, which is that since service levels in many cases have decreased significantly, you know, the question becomes, how do you compare those statistics to what was in the report in the prior year? And I think we're seeing someone scream in the background, but
Bailey.
In terms of the validation, yeah, we're looking into that closely, and that's one role of folks you're talking to right now, Joe and Matt and Bailey. We've adjusted already some of the tolerances in the data validation to make sure it's reflective of actual service trends that we know about from the monthly ridership data that has been reported so far. FDA has a fairly representative sample of monthly ridership data, and thanks to all of you who are involved in that for keeping information coming in with which we were able to make those estimates. So it won't be a normal year in terms of, it won't be apples to oranges, I guess, that we're comparing. If you're looking at trends, this trend in ridership in terms of the decrease is unprecedented. So we're still exploring how to validate other service statistics that we don't have as much data on yet. But if you have concerns or, you know, just recommendations that you want to talk through, we encourage you to email the NTD Help Desk, ntdhelp@dot.gov. And there's kind of a clarification, I think a follow-up. If we dropped out our service levels 50% after mid-March, then I report that level as our scheduled service level in the average and total schedule for the year. Matt, can you provide some clarity on that one? I think the question is about
so yeah, I think what Robert's getting at there is correct, if I'm understanding him correctly. So so yes, it's not the original plan at the beginning of the year. It's I guess one way to think about it is the schedule that's published to your riders at the time. So when you dropped your service 50% in mid-March, you probably issued new schedules for the riders so they know what the reduced levels are, or at least have an announcement on your website, something like that. So that's what's considered to be the scheduled service. So another way to put it is if you think of it like seasonal service, some agencies might operate a reduced service during the summer months. Basically, you have a mega summer from mid-March until we cross our fingers and hope it's soon.
Okay, thanks. I think the next question is anonymous attendee. Are days in which we operated reduced service due to the pandemic considered atypical days?
No, those are considered typical days. So as typical days, they do get included in the average weekday, average Saturday, and average Sunday. So the only days that would be considered atypical would be more one-off events, like a special event, or like a day with, like you might be having up there, Lori, in New Jersey, with hurricane service. So there's lower service for that reason. So pandemic reduced service days are considered typical.
Great, thanks. A question from Marilyn. If we are using the vehicles for emergency services and non-passenger services, do we need to exclude fueling for these vehicles also?
Ideally, yes. We realize you're probably going to need to do some sort of an estimate there. It's probably not possible to track that gallon for gallon. But yes, fuel for non-public transportation services should not be reported as fuel on the A30 form.
I accidentally cleared out a question about the questions being available. I'm not sure where it went. I think in the answered. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Yes, I can get you a copy of the Q&A once it's available for me to download. So just send me an email. It's lglickman@nti.rutgers.edu. I put it in the chat box. If you scroll up, it's there, but I can paste it again. Okay, so that was the last question, I think. Sorry, I'm doing like 3 things at once. We have 1 more minute, and because I know we're on a strict deadline this time, so I'm not sure we can take any more questions. There aren't any. I'm just gonna remind everybody, if they do have further questions, they can email the help desk that is on the slide there. My email and the link to the handouts were in the webinar chat box. And if nobody else has anything to say, I'm just gonna wrap this up. Is that good? Everybody?
Great, thank you, Lori.
Okay, so great. Thanks everyone, thank you. Very special thank you for Joe, Matt, and Bailey, and I appreciate all the attendees for putting up with the little technical glitches due to the weather event and, you know, just normal tech stuff happening. I would like to remind everyone that you will be getting a link to fill out a survey. We really appreciate your feedback, so please it's just a couple minutes. Fill that out when it arrives. And everyone, be safe and be well. And I'm going to type my email one more time in the chat box before I close everything down so you can grab it. Thanks, everybody.